Hello everyone and welcome to part 3 of chapter 3. This video will go over the concerns and media effects of the video gaming industry. I do want to note that this video goes over some very heavy topics and may include some images of violence or language that may be upsetting to you. I understand that and try to take extreme caution in showing any materials to you, but I wanted to give you that warning so you can be in the proper headspace as you think about the media effects of gaming. However, I do think it's important for us to discuss these concerns given the prevalence of gaming in our culture, as well as some of the serious effects that the industry and video games themselves can have on human behavior. So with that, please know that you have resources available to you if you have any concerns about mental health, including free counseling provided by the University of Montevallo. And you certainly don't have to limit that only to feeling anxious or upset by material covered in this video. Of course, right now, everyone is handling extreme pressure and stress, so I highly encourage you to always be aware of your mental health. However, I wanted to provide that note to you prior to starting this video. Hopefully it shouldn't be anything that you haven't seen in prior classes or just in watching regular television, but just wanted to give you that warning. So here we go. You may recognize these three gentlemen from news and other documentaries about school shootings or mass shootings. Gentlemen on the left are the two shooters of Columbine High School. In the middle, you have the shooter at Sandy Hook Elementary School. And on the right, the shooter of the Aurora, Colorado movie theater. Now, what do all three of these people have in common other than being mass shooters? They played video games. So what does that mean in terms of video game culture? Whenever a mass shooting happens in America, one of the areas that we tend to look at is how video gaming and violence played into the behavior for that shooter and their mental health. And yet many studies have been done to look at how video games affect mental health with some very differing results. Let's take a look. So that's an opinion piece written by a gamer for the New York Times. And you can hear some of the arguments both for and against considering video games as a link, an effect to violent behavior. Now, in this opinion piece, the commentator claims that there is no empirical evidence that video games have been linked to violent behavior. However, that's somewhat true. There are studies that show that there is no significant relationship between violent video game exposure and school shooting incidents, meaning that there is no justification found in the relationships between these two things to suggest that one causes the other. In other studies, there are positive correlations, though, between exposure to violent video games and adolescent aggression. And I think that this is where the topic of video games and its effect on violent behavior comes from, because many studies have found that the more someone plays video games, violent video games specifically, the more likely they are to demonstrate aggression. In fact, many studies over time have shown negative effects of violent video games. The main cause is increased aggression. Now remember, aggression does not necessarily lead to violent behavior. However, it is one of the first effective or emotional steps in that happening. So we do see significant effects of video games on aggression in terms of short term, meaning they played violent video games and then kind of rehearsed mental scripts that were also violent in nature. With repeated exposure to violent video games, studies have shown that there is some hardwiring for aggression-related mental structures that can result in a more aggressive personality, especially when the video game player starts at a young age prior to puberty when your brain is still forming. In addition, studies have found that over time, longitudinally, that repeated exposure to violent video games can increase aggression, which can be seen in gaming populations worldwide. This data comes from a lot of peer-reviewed scientific studies that have been legitimized by our field. In addition, these studies have shown higher levels of aggressive thoughts, emotions, and behavior, decrease in empathy and willingness to help others, the ability to reward violent behavior during play, increasing hostile behavior afterwards, a feeling of dehumanization, meaning you tend to think about people less as people and more just as figures in a game, and desensitization to violent acts, which suggests that you don't act to violent material in a shocking way anymore. It just becomes second nature and you're used to it. So these are all effects that studies have shown. And again, these are very legitimate scientific studies that have been done by researchers who are using the correct scientific means to do so. In fact, Bartlett in 2009 suggested that after 15 minutes of playing Mortal Kombat, participants were increasingly physically aroused through aggressive thought and behavior patterns. Those hostile thoughts and feelings lasted less than 4 minutes after the end of the violent video game play, but the aggressive behavior and subsequent elevated heart rate lasted for 10 minutes or longer, depending upon the participant. High quality studies show that gamers are more inclined to inflict a higher level of discomfort on others compared to those who do not play violent video games. So again, here's another study that kind of supports the negative effect of violent video games. But what if that's not the true story? You'll notice that in a lot of video game studies, in a lot of video game research, that the words violence and aggression are not clearly defined. Aggression is a feeling of hostility or anger towards an individual. It is a feeling, an emotion, where violence is an actual behavior, an act. And so tendencies towards violence versus actually being violent are two different things. And sometimes studies do not clearly define this within their makeup. In addition, most studies only use one particular game for a fixed amount of playing time, such as Bartlett's study, which looks solely at Mortal Kombat and then only had people play for intervals of 15 or 30 minutes. Trying to establish a causal relationship where playing violent video games causes someone to be aggressive in real life can depend upon other variables as well, such as the player's age, gender, or personality. So it's very difficult to establish a true causal relationship that can be generalized across all populations. And finally, many studies are conducted with relatively small and non-random, non-representative samples, meaning that the results could be skewed. But there is a third side to consider here. It's not just whether the studies are good or bad, but it could also be that playing violent video games doesn't cause aggression, but rather being an aggressive personality causes you to seek out violent video games. This is considered in the downward spiral model, which suggests that aggressive players seek out violent video games in order to satisfy their personality and needs. This is more of a uses and gratification approach. The uses and gratification theory suggests that you use media for particular needs and goals within your life. And so in this sense, you would be using violent video games to kind of help you drive out your aggressive personality through a positive, nonviolent outlet. It also suggests that you selectively expose yourself to violent video games because you prefer them. So this is another theory to consider when talking about the effects of violent video game play. In 2010, a study found that individuals who had high emotion, high indifference for others, high in rule breaking, were more likely to experience negative outcomes in violent video game studies than those who did not have these personality attributes. So again, it could be a downward spiral model that we're talking about, where people who are already aggressive could be playing violent video games and thus become even more aggressive in their personalities. But there are other concerns with gaming besides violence. Gaming disorder is considered a mental health condition by the World Health Organization. Gaming disorder is an addiction for which 8.5% of Americans suffer. Males are more likely to be addicted, even within the gaming communities, which again are fairly even in the gender disparity of who plays video games. And the appropriateness level must be considered within this as well as an additional concern of gaming, because 9% of games are rated mature by the ESRB, which thankfully is down 13% from previous years, but it's still something that many parents have to consider whether a game is considered appropriate or not for their young player. There are many other concerns with gaming, including misogyny and a lack of diversity. Misogyny means representing male views and portraying women in very inappropriate and not helpful light, as you can see in the image on the left of popular female video game characters. They are highly sexualized and treated as objects as opposed to actual people, which can become a problem. There's also a lack of diversity, not only in the gaming characters that are often offered in video games, but also in the representations of those races and genders, as well as other types of representation, such as having a disability, a mental illness, or things of that nature. Now, we're going to be talking a lot in our discussion post about Gamergate, but I wanted to discuss this with you because it is an area that I have studied. It's an area of interest that I have. Gamergate occurred when female game developers were speaking out about why their games were not being green-lighted within the business. And they began using the hashtag Gamergate to talk about how females were not being properly represented within the video gaming industry. However, the hashtag activism took a sad turn when many trolls on the internet started threatening these female game developers for speaking out. Many of these females, as well as people who were supported them, were doxxed, where they were sent very graphic images of themselves, as you can see in the right-hand corner, even pornographic images with their face edited onto them, which are all highly disturbing. And this was being flooded into not only their direct messages, but also in the hashtag. And it really sadly showed a lot of the existing misogyny that's currently within the video game industry. And so this, while a terrible, terrible incident, has brought attention to the lack of diversity in video game developers, and the video gaming industry has really worked, especially since Gamergate, to overcome these diversity issues and be more inclusive, both in the business side and in the content side. But I don't want to just talk about negative effects of gaming, because let's face it, I'm a gamer. I love to play games. I allow my 5-year-old daughter to play her games. And not all gaming is bad. And I think it can get a very bad rap because we don't often consider the positive effects. The first positive effect is cognitive. People who play shooter games actually have much faster and accurate attention speeds, according to studies. They have higher spatial resolution for visual processing of information, and they're able to mentally rotate their abilities, meaning they can be creative 1 minute, logical the next, etc. And in fact, video games have been shown to enhance children's creative capabilities. So these are all cognitive and logical developments that gaming can play. I think we can also see that there are many games that are actually educational. My daughter plays games that are geared towards math skills or reading skills. I told you I really grew up using Reader Rabbit to be able to learn how to read and type. And so there are many beneficial games that can help with cognitive abilities. There are also emotional benefits to gaming. Games that have low cognitive demands can actually improve moods, promote relaxation, and ward off anxiety. It's probably why when you have a very difficult day, you sit in front of the TV or in front of your phone and you start playing a game. In addition, the games can teach players the benefits of dealing with frustration and anxiety, overcoming difficulties as they are playing the game. There are also motivational benefits to gaming. Gaming can teach basic lessons such as persistence or how to be optimistic about reaching goals, how to win appropriately. And so those can be good motivational benefits to gaming as well. And then of course, gaming is very social and it can have social benefits. Lots of gaming is social, utilizing cooperative play where you really have to rely on one another in order to succeed. Helping behaviors have been observed within the gaming studies, even in violent video games. You know, some of the cool parts about playing Call of Duty or Halo is playing with your friends and having to work towards that goal together. So it can be very social in nature as well. And violent games, when played cooperatively, actually decrease players' access to aggressive cognitions. Meaning, if you're playing these violent video games with other people, you're less likely to see the negative effects that violent video games have the ability to cause. If you're interested in gaming, I'm not familiar with this group, but it was mentioned to me, so I thought I'd give them a plug. But the Montevallo Organization of Gaming does exist here on campus, and it's a bunch of fun people who really love games. So be sure to reach out if you're interested in joining that club. So now that we've talked about the development of games, we've also discussed kind of the convergence and business model of gaming. And now we've talked about positive and negative effects of gaming as well. That's going to end our review of the chapter. So make sure that you finish your discussion post on diversity in gaming, which will focus primarily on Gamergate. If you have any questions or need me for anything, please feel free to reach out. After you finish your discussion post, that's going to be it for week 3. You guys are doing a great job. Make sure you read chapter 10, which will be about books and the power of print.